Maximize your yields while spreading out your workload with the earliest maturing winter cereal. Visit kws.com/ca to see how our hybrid rye varieties can work for you. High yields, high quality, high value for your farm. KWS, seeding the future since 1856.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Hello and welcome to this Tuesday, July 9th episode of RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your host for Tuesdays with Lyndsey Smith, and today's show is brought to you by FP Genetics, which means stick around. In our third segment, we're going to have a product spotlight with Chad Yanchycki. He's going to tell us all about hybrid rye, about some exciting new hybrids coming down the pipeline, about what we've learned in 10 years of growing hybrid rye. So check that out in our third segment. We've got, though, a fantastic show lined up, a lot of information here, and I'm pretty sure a couple things to get people talking. So first off, we're going to hear from Dr. Tim Arthur. He is with the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association. He's now the president, and we are going to talk about, and this is a big one, the issue of calling animals sentient or sentient beings. Please listen, and I really want your feedback on this one. It has the potential to be a very volatile topic, or perhaps not. And that's the conversation that we're going to have. Then we've also got, if you're in Western Canada, you have probably, if you're a co-op customer, been dealing with card lock systems that were down for quite some time, perhaps the grocery store not working, and, well, frankly, we're not out of the woods yet on the latest cyber attack on the Federated Co-op Limited out in Western Canada. We, of course, also had just recently CDK Global, which offers software to car dealerships, but also farm equipment dealerships. They had a cyber attack. So to talk about the potentially increasing risk of cyber attacks in agriculture, what we can and can't do about it, and frankly, what we need to be planning for in the future, I've got Chris Law with MNP. He's going to join me later in the show. And then to round out today's show, let's talk feed regulations. Yes, 14 years in the making. We now have a new set of feed regulations. So these are regulations that our feed companies, our feed suppliers have to follow. And yes, it's taken, well, almost 15 years to move some modernization forward within the feed industries. So Melissa Dumont, who is the executive director of ANAC, the Animal Nutrition Association of Canada, she's going to join me to round out the show to talk about what's in these feed regulations and what, if anything, producers may notice from their feed supplier. All right, as always, please find us across social media. We're a very social bunch. We're on Instagram, TikTok, X, Facebook, you name it, we're there, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Let's take a quick break, and I'll be back with more of today's show brought to you by FP Genetics right after this.
Join us for the Canadian Beef Industry Conference, August 19th to 22nd in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Spend time networking on the trade show floor, hear from keynote speakers, and take in breakout sessions designed to increase profit, manage your rangeland, and navigate trends. Get up close to advanced techniques and hands-on demos, and kicking it all off is Lamley's Bull event. Proud, sustainable, and innovative, we are beef. Registration is now open. Visit CanadianBeefIndustryConference.com for full details and to register.
Peter Johnson at WheatPete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results, help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
The Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com has everything you need to get your crop off to a great start and a strong finish. Whether you're growing chickpeas, fava beans, lentils, or peas, you'll get all the latest and best agronomic information at PulseSchool.com. A library of top-notch agronomy videos from industry experts available on demand at your fingertips. Visit the Pulse School, brought to you by BASF on RealAgriculture.com.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your host for this Tuesday show, Lyndsey Smith, and today's show is brought to you by FP Genetics. All right, we hop now to an incredibly important discussion. If you're a livestock producer, for sure, but also, frankly, just for people everywhere who maybe have pets or perhaps eat meat. The question of whether or not animals are sentient beings is one that, well, if you're a livestock producer, might make the hair on your neck stand up just a little. It's controversial, and for good reason. There are certainly feelings, things, ideas that might go along with recognizing animals as sentient. Case in point, where we cross the line from talking about animal welfare to animal rights. Recently, there was a veterinary conference in Calgary, and it brought together several different aspects of having this conversation about whether or not farmers are sentient beings. And the chair of that panel is Dr. Tim Arthur, and I have him now to talk about his feelings as a veterinarian as to whether or not considering animals as sentient beings is a slippery slope, or if potentially it's simply the way things are going. Joining me now is Dr. Tim Arthur. He's now the newly minted president of the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association. Tim, welcome here.
Good morning, Lyndsey. How are you?
I'm doing so well, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. It's a big one. It's a challenging one, but I'm really anticipating a neat conversation here on animals being sentient beings. That's sort of the overarching topic here. But let's dive into just recently, you did have your association had its annual meeting. You are now president of that. And there was a panel talking about animals as sentient beings and how that may impact veterinary medicine. So let's maybe start there. What was the panel about? What was sort of discussed?
Sure. So as president-elect of this organization, one of my duties was to look at a subject that might impact my profession, veterinary medicine, in the future, and then get a large number of people in a room that have higher IQs than I do, and have a discussion about that particular topic and try to figure out, all right, what might be coming down the pipe, and is there anything that we need to do about it? Beware of, changes need to be made. Let's just deal with this now, as opposed to when it shows up on the doorstep. And the topic I selected was animal sentience. Straightforward out front. I am a veterinarian, but the last 5-10 years of my career, animal welfare has gone much higher on the list than what it used to be. And we recently put together and published a position statement on sentience. And it kind of caught my eye from the point of view of, I went into that research with okay, I've got a fair idea that I know what I'm talking about. And I came out of it with whoa, that was a lot more complicated than I really thought it should be. I went in with this has potentials to be kind of scary, and came out with I don't really think we have a whole lot to worry about here.
So as a livestock producer myself, and a large part of our audience would be, I think many of us might sit on that same side of this has the potential to be very scary for what we do as a profession. So I hadn't actually thought about it from the veterinary perspective, but I think that would be a commonality potentially for other veterinarians as well as livestock producers. So let's explore that a little. Sure. Why after sort of delving into this, do you feel somewhat more perhaps at peace with this not maybe being super scary.
Right. So let me give you the worst case scenario that some people would bring up that you kind of went, yo boy, yeah, this is going to be a problem. And that one would be that I'm a veterinarian. I practice on patients. In my case, they're mostly dogs and cats. I do a bunch of wildlife work. And let's just say I do something wrong. Didn't mean to do it wrong, but nevertheless, something was wrong. And so I am now in front of the courts with a very angry guardian of that animal that I harmed. And there currently is a huge difference between what I as a veterinarian may be tasked at by the courts versus if I was a physician and I had harmed a child. Right. Now, I think all of us would accept that a child is sentient. What happens if we put that moniker on a dog? Does that mean that as a professional, I now have an awful lot to worry about? My malpractice insurance is going to go right through the roof, and I need to be practicing with much more concern about what a lawyer may do to me than the concerns that I currently have. Right. So, from the veterinary point of view, that would be the main issue. The other part of it is, as a veterinarian, I do things on a daily basis that cause animals pain. I give them vaccines, I put catheters in, I run anesthetics, I do surgery. There's all this stuff that causes pain. If an animal is declared sentient, do I have to give that animal a choice as to whether it wants to receive that pain or not? Or am I allowed to make decisions for it? So at the summit, basically what we did is we got together 3 knowledgeable people. One was a behavioral biologist, didn't even know that existed, but their job in the world is to just look at the way animals behave and try to tease out why they're doing that. But, from a strictly scientific point of view, we had a lawyer from Quebec who went through what has happened since Quebec wrote sentience into their animal welfare legislation, and they did it about 2 years ago. What's changed? And then we had a veterinarian from Europe, and there are a number of countries in Europe where sentience has already been recognized. And what's the difference practicing over there as a veterinarian versus practicing over here? Mm-hmm. And the general conclusion that we came to is that there really isn't that much difference. Putting the tag of sentience on an animal certainly does not automatically give it rights. In our legal system, an animal is a piece of chattel. It can be owned, it can be bought, it can be sold. You can do what you wish with it. And the fact that it is sentient chattel doesn't make it any different than your tractor or your refrigerator. So the actual term doesn't change the legal standing of it. The other thing that sort of came out is, although it's not written in legislation in very many places, in Canada, Quebec is the only province that has recognized it. When you sit back and think about it, it's actually the basis of most of our animal welfare legislation that was put in place like years and years and years ago. Why do we treat a cow different than we treat a car? It's because we've already come to the conclusion that cow can feel pain. But the next step is, yourself as a farmer, I'm pretty sure you've already come to the conclusion that you can tell a happy cow from an unhappy cow. And that's very different from a painful cow versus a non-painful cow. There's places they want to be. There's places they don't want to be. There's places, they want to congregate. Most of them don't want to be singles. And that's what sentience is. We just have never written it down.
So I think we also, like as a livestock producer, and even as a parent, right? So these are very separate things, you're right. And I think you've done an excellent job of sort of outlining these differences here. But as a livestock producer, something that I do, like giving a vaccine or potentially treating a wound that is perhaps painful and actually fearful for that animal, potentially, if they're being handled and they're not used to it, etc. I, though, know that it's for the good. right? I know that I'm helping them, that they're going to feel better, that it's, it's that short-term pain for long-term health, right? So we make that call for them. And you're right, we absolutely think of animals differently than a car, and we think of rules differently for how we treat our cars versus a cow or a sheep. So that does already exist sort of from, a logical point. Do we need, though, then, this word sentience added to our language, to the rules, to, as you say in Quebec, that it's been added to some of these things? Or do we potentially open up a proverbial can of worms on this?
Right. So I guess what I would say is I think the can of worms is already opened. And I don't know that adding a term to describe what most of us already accept as, that's maybe it's not factual, but it's certainly logical and it makes sense and it's probably there. I don't know that adding the term really causes a whole lot of troubles that we don't already have. We, like animal welfare point of view, we look at sentience as a foundational piece. If it's not there, then everything we're doing in the world of welfare doesn't really have a whole lot of basis to have done it already. So why not give it a term? Why not state it? The problem would be, okay, what does Canadian society, what do our politicians, what do they decide to do with that term? So to me, there's three things. There's animal ethics. How you and I feel when we're working with an animal. Does it make us feel good? Does it make us feel bad? There's animal welfare. How is the animal feeling? So it's not us, it's them. And then there's this mysterious term called animal rights. And animal rights, I think, is society has to bestow that. It doesn't just automatically show up.
All right. In the interest of time, because of course I've only got 1 hour for this show, there is actually a much longer version of this conversation on RealAgriculture.com, at YouTube, on our podcast feed. Go and check it out. But I wanted to sum up a few of the points that Dr. Arthur makes in the rest of our conversation. And that is, so his point really being on this sentience piece, is that he's had people come up to him and say, oh, good, now if we declare animals sentient, people will stop eating beef. And he said, well, no. People eat beef because they want to, because that's part of their diet, because as a culture, as a society, we eat beef. Another person said, oh, good, now I can eat horse. And Dr. Arthur says, well, probably culturally, no, you can't, because in Canada, at least, most of North America, horse is not acceptable as something to eat. His point being that we as a society get to decide what is okay and what is not, what is culturally acceptable and what is not. And realistically, that sentiment of us as individuals is reflected in our laws and the decisions that our lawmakers make. So this is far more complicated, obviously, and this isn't just about an animal rights push, but it's definitely a point where I think we need more conversation. And my conversation with Dr. Arthur certainly opened my eyes to a few other aspects of this that I probably wasn't aware of before. All right, if you've got feedback on this or anything else we talk about on today's show, of course, zip me an email, lsmith@realagriculture.com, or you can call that feedback line 855-776-6147. We're going to take a quick break, and I will be back with a product spotlight with FP Genetics right after this.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
Choose Viatude fungicide and unleash best-in-class sclerotinia protection in canola and premium protection against white mold in soybeans. Viatude contains a powerful premix of Onmira Active and prothioconazole. This unique combo delivers high-performance disease control, crop safety, mix compatibility, resistance management, and advanced mobility for excellent coverage and superior plant protection. Choose Viatude fungicide for stronger, more vigorous crops.
I'm Lyndsey Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomists, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomists with me, Lyndsey Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern. Welcome back to Real Ag Radio. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and it is time for today's Product Spotlight. Joining me now from FP Genetics, I have Chad Yanchycki, Territory Manager out of Manitoba. Chad, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
All right. We are going to talk about hybrid rye, which is super exciting. We've got a 10-year, I did not realize this, a 10-year history. FP Genetics and hybrid rye go back 10 years. What have we learned in a decade of growing hybrid rye here in Canada?
Oh, we've learned lots. The big thing is, we know farmers are looking for reliable varieties that are well suited for here in Canada. And so we've gone hard to work on finding those varieties. The other thing is just not treating it like the old rye that we used to treat it back in the day, and throwing rye on any quarter. The one thing we really focus on is getting people to understand that it's a high-value crop and something that you really want to put on ground that's well drained and it's not going to have a bunch of standing water in the springtime. Rye's got really, really good winter survivability and handles the cold climates that we have here very well. But the one area where you want to watch is just that standing water in the springtime. So picking those well-drained fields are extremely important. The other thing is fertilizer. So a big thing with that is getting your fertilizer applied if you can in the fall time. We have too often we're seeing it lots here on the prairies where we're either in a drought or we're in a really wet year. And, on a drought, it's hard for people to justify spray or putting on some fertilizer in the springtime if you don't know rain's going to come. And in cases sometimes this year we're really wet here in Manitoba, where it's hard to get on to some of the wet fields. So if we can get that fertilizer on in the fall time, majority of it are doing a split up and getting the rest on early in the spring. That's kind of the way we want to go. Rye sets its yield potential really early in the springtime. So when that crown hits 0 degrees, you got about 3 weeks. So you want to make sure that fertilizer is readily available when that rye crop really needs to utilize it.
Now, tell me about FP Genetics, the collaboration with SeedNet. How did that come to be, and why is that important for the rye sector? Yeah,
well, you know what? They're two Canadian farmer-owned companies, SeedNet and FP Genetics, and both companies that originally brought hybrid rye here to Canada. So for us, we sat down as a group, and it just made sense for us to join forces and partner up and really bring them the next wave of varieties here for Canadian farmers. So we're excited. They've got a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the production side, and us with distribution, marketing, and finding varieties and stuff. So I think it's going to be really exciting and a lot of fun. And I think what growers can expect is to see a lot of really good varieties coming here for them to use. Yeah, so access to new genetics, always exciting. Certainly a huge benefit for farmers who are interested in this crop. But of course, you need a market for it. So what is the market dynamic now? How do you see it moving forward? I think it's a really exciting time for growers to grow rye. The prices are some of the best I've seen in my time dealing with rye. They're very strong, and I think it's an exciting time. The market is there. And there's becoming a little bit more and more market opportunities each year. So I think that's another exciting thing. And it's a rotational thing that fits really well in a lot of farms. There's a lot of different markets that are starting to open up in that rye sector. And then we got, obviously, our two new varieties that we're bringing this year, SU Performer and SU Kisani, that look really, really exciting. All right, so tell me more about the new varieties that farmers might have access to this fall should they choose to plant hybrid rye. Okay, perfect. So yeah, we got two brand new varieties we're bringing to market here for farmers this year, SU Kasani and SU Performer. Both are which are suited very well for grain or for forage. Good standability to them, good for ergot, very good winter hardiness to them. The one thing we noticed with our new varieties here is the fall and spring vigor on them are very strong. We noticed it the last couple of years looking at plots and some of the field scales that we had. It pops up really nice in the fall time, which is super important for rye when you're going into a winter. You want a well-established crop and something that's pretty uniform. We always kind of talk as a group that rye is an interesting crop to grow because it's got to survive 11 months of the year in our Canadian climate. So the more we can have it going in at a kind of a uniform stand and a good stand going into fall is super important. And that also helps with the ergot side of it as well. So when you're looking at those varieties that pop out of the ground nice, have good establishment, and are uniform, that's going to bode well just from an ergot side, a yield side, and just growing rye in general.
All right. Okay. So something to look forward to certainly as the season goes on. Now, one of the questions, of course, any with a change in a crop or new varieties, a new hybrid, it always becomes a question of seed availability. So how easy is it for farmers to access hybrid rye seed right now and looking to the fall?
Yeah, we're in a good position with seeds, so we got lots of seed availability. We've kind of redone our distribution network, so there's lots of access to rye. Really reaching out to an FP territory manager, going on fpgenetics.ca or hybridfallrye.ca. You'll be able to find all of our dealers on there, but there's a ton of dealers that'll be offering the new FP Genetics rye and the SU Kasani and SU Performer varieties. So it's very easy for them to find through any of those or reaching out to anybody at FP. And they'll have access pretty close by to wherever they are in most parts across Western Canada.
All right. Okay. So exciting times in the hybrid rye world. Chad, thank you so much for joining me for today's Product Spotlight.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. And we'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
It's summertime, and you've got a lot of important decisions to make when it comes to your corn crop. Let the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com help guide you through those big decisions with input from leading experts in the field. If it's spray timing, disease identification, or any other field issue, the Corn School's got you covered. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com, brought to you by BASF and Pride Seeds.
I get to spend every day talking to farmers in the ag industry through RealAgriculture.com and RealAg Radio. But nothing is more fun than speaking to an audience live and in person. If you're planning an ag event, book a Real Agriculture speaker to make it a successful and memorable experience. Email shaney@realagriculture.com and you can book myself or any other Real Ag personality to speak at your event. Bring your audience all the fun, insight, and energy of Real Agriculture.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on this Tuesday, July 9th. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and today's show is brought to you by FP Genetics. All right, we hop now to a part of my conversation with Chris Law of MNP. Again, head over to realagriculture.com. You can hear the entire conversation. But I wanted to know about cybersecurity, managing this risk, and what potentially agriculture can do to protect itself against ransomware attacks and other hacks. All right, joining me now to talk about a rather large, scary, overwhelming undertaking, and that is cybersecurity, is Chris Law. He's partner with MNP and national lead for incident response with MNP. Chris, welcome here.
Thank you, Lyndsey. Happy to be here.
So thank you for saying yes, because this is one of those topics where we sit back here at Real Agriculture and think, who can even speak to sort of the wide range of what is considered cybersecurity and how we protect ourselves. There's certainly, and we're going to talk about some of those bigger picture issues right now, but let's first start at maybe some of the more basic sort of everyday things that farmers, agribusinesses need to be aware of as far as cybersecurity and where they may be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question to start. And I think, First off, I want to say let's not overthink it. I mean, we all see those shows, those movies where there's all these sophisticated, hackers or threat actors that do all these, unfortunate things with large millions of dollars of ransomware. Yes, that still exists. That will always continue to exist. However, for the majority, what we're seeing, especially in Canada, in the prairies, right across the board, is the fact that there is ongoing basic fraud that's being performed through computers and laptops and whatnot. And I think the easiest way to protect oneself is to, first off, make sure, you've heard of the many basic fundamentals, we'll call them table stakes, things or practices that everyone should be aware of. And that is, first off, multi-factor authentication, or MFA. So everybody has a password. Everybody knows that they should have a hopefully hard to guess password that they can remember and they don't write down. But more importantly, you can have a simple password, but as long as you have another form of authentication with that account, whatever that is you use, that will make sure that you're much more secure than the person that perhaps just has a long password. So with that, it helps prevent, I would say, almost 50 to 60% of the potential incidents that would occur. And many times, some of these larger incidents you've heard of, it's because they never had fully implemented multi-factor. The second would be to make sure that you understand your third parties. Quite often what we see is your organization or your sort of space in this world is you've done some good things. You know what to do, and you've seen enough people telling you, okay, you have to do all these security and be mindful of what you're doing. However, you have to work with partners. You may have partners that handle your payroll, or some cloud service provider that does certain things on your behalf. You let them into your organization, or you give your data to them so that they can, handle things on your behalf too, so that you can focus on your egg business. And that's great. What we're seeing is, unfortunately, the threat actors know that rather than knocking on everyone's door, they can just knock on the service provider for the egg business. And so with that, they get immediate access to their data, to your data, which you gave to them. So it's always important to vet them to make sure that you're going with a secure, reputable service provider.
That is one of the things that certainly, as we see this, is that there's several layers to this, right? And as you pointed out, there's, our everyday as a person or a business, our banking, having that's right, that secondary authenticator, which maybe it's your phone, maybe it's an email, those sorts of things. But increasingly, and I think this is where there is a lot of concern, is that, as an individual or as a business, I may take those extra measures, but every time I add, as you say, a piece of software or a third party or someone else who has access to either my banking data or even let's say my field data, I have to trust that that company is also protected. And we're certainly seeing right now, really coming very close to home here in agriculture, where it seems to be, an outside or a software provider that they have been attacked and potentially held to ransom for their software or for that access. This is where I get sort of scratching my head and trying to think, how do I, as an individual or as a farm, when I'm working with different companies, how do I know that, their platform is safe potentially?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, Lyndsey. And short answer is you don't know. I mean, we are not all cybersecurity experts. We're not expected to be. Hopefully, we all focus on ag and what our core business is. What we have to do is work with the providers, but also with experts, saying, okay, you know what? If we have a number of farms or agricultural facilities, we obviously likely use the same provider. And so with that, it's always good to obviously try to collaborate first with them to make sure that, hey, what kind of information you're giving them, but at the same time, ask them for, are you safe? What measures are they taking to protect the data and make sure that they're available, their services are available to us when and if we need it? And of course, you're going to get the usual marketing speak where it's like, yeah, we're perfect. We do all these wonderful things. Right. And that may be true, not saying that they don't. However, as time shows, there's been many of these third party or service providers that have been breached. And usually what happens when that occurs is the fact that they unfortunately circle the wagons and then they get legal and you're kind of left out in the cold. You won't get too much help. You won't get very much notification and you may not have an alternative. So I think one of the first things we do with a lot of the ag clients that we have, as well as municipalities, is the fact that we reach out to each other, meaning we work on alternatives. We need to have backup plans, right?
Right.
If this were to go down, if this service were to go down, do we have an alternative? What can we do? And in addition to that, work together with each other in our communities to figure out this is going to be a common problem, and I think it's always important to understand that and understand also, is there a way to make sure that we have, or at least can recover, albeit manually or in some other fashion? So ensuring your own backups of your own system. It's always important not to trust another service provider 100%. We also must ensure that we have our own data that we need to do to, if we have to move to another provider or try to do manually steps in the interim.
Right. So we saw, in the last little while, I believe it's CDK Global. I think the estimate is something like 15,000 dealerships. So this is, yes, car dealerships, but it also impacted agriculture dealerships as well. They were in that. And then, of course, we're seeing the federated co-op issue starting to resolve itself. I think as of Friday, the card lock system across the prairies is now operational again. But you did mention that about having either a backup or some other means or way to sort of reset to maybe a certain point. That seems to be potentially, with this FCL issue that, billing might be affected, being able to just continue processing, it may be impacted. So in thinking about how large scale some of these impacts can be, you did mention, having those backups, et cetera, but it feels to me like we are sitting ducks in a lot of ways. Like, are there ways that you really can completely, ransomware proof a business, or is it really about just mitigating that risk?
It's about mitigating that risk. Unfortunately, in any organization, as many people have heard and said over many years, it's only a matter of time before an organization is unfortunately compromised, and it can be no fault of that single organization or the third party. The idea is that if there's a determined threat actor or hacker, that they will be able to compromise that organization eventually. Now, that being said, let's accept that fact. But also, what's going to carry on and maintain a reputation in our business is how we deal with it. And I think that's the inevitability, is the fact that every single organization will be hacked, or if not already, or in the process of being hacked. You've heard all that before, but really making sure we have the methodology and the approach and the process to deal with that. Now, as you can imagine with CDK and all the auto dealerships, they'd had to resort overnight, almost like COVID, to doing things manually so that they can with the car sales or whatever that leasing agreement is, finding out manual ways, albeit slower, probably not as efficient. But in the past, that's how we did in the first place. So not forgetting that, but also more importantly, practicing worst case scenario. If that one provider, or if this one service or this one system was down, can we carry on business? And let's practice that. Let's figure out what that is, and let's practice it. And let's put that as an emergency, whatever you call it, break the glass, pull out the handbook and do it that way.
Goodness. Think of all the ways we use technology and software, and imagine then going back to paper. But potentially, for some of us, it's a reality, depending on what happens. All right, let's take a quick break, and I will be back with our last segment of today's show, brought to you by FP Genetics, right after this.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Sean Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 587-787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today. Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on this Tuesday, July 9th. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and today's show is brought to you by FP Genetics. All right, I am Lyndsey Smith with Real Agriculture, and joining me now is Melissa Dumont. She's the Executive Director of the Animal Nutrition Association of Canada. Welcome here, Melissa.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Okay, so ANAC, as we'll call it, what is this organization? There's probably a lot of people who don't know that this organization exists. So what is it? What do you do?
So ANAC is the National Association for the Feed Industry. So we represent all different segments of the feed industry, the commercial feed manufacturers, as well as the ingredient suppliers, consultants, other services, goods and services to the industry. That is all what makes up ANAC's membership. Okay. And our role is to really work at the national level and work for our members when it comes to many things, government and relations, to ensure that they have the best business environment that they can to be able to produce the best feed for our farms here in Canada. So we do a lot of other things that are not regulatory and not government related to support our members. But a lot of the work that we do has to do with ensuring that they understand the regulations that they need to follow, and that they also have a voice at the table when there's consultations happening or there's different parts of different regulations that are going to impact their business, that we're the voice for them at the table.
So now this, of course, then is why we're having this conversation today, in that there has been a new set of regulations published. So in Gazette 2, which is where a final regulation is published for Canadian rules. This has been, and maybe you can fill us in for those who haven't been following along, and you can be excused for having not, because we're talking over a decade of some of these changes being worked on. So something like 14 years. So these new regulations are out. First, let's start with sort of how we got here. This has been a long process. Where are we at now? How did we get here?
Yeah. Well, we like you said, it was a long road to get here. And, the late 2000s, it became very clear as an industry that we needed new regulations to be able to best serve producers and provide the best feed for their livestock. Our prior set of regulations dated back to 1983. And the way that we feed livestock, or we fed livestock in 1983, and the role that we needed government to play in protecting that industry was very different than it is today. So in 2010, our association decided to write a white paper with the intent to present it to the government to present a case to modernize the feed regulations. So talking about the challenges with the current regulations, as well as providing them with ideas and solutions on how that could be remedied. So in 2011, we got the great news, the announcement finally from the president of CFIA, who was George Dumont at the time. He told us, you know what? You guys have a great case. We're modernizing all of our regulations within the government, but you guys are at the forefront because you not only came to us with problems or complaints, but you also came to us with solutions that are very well aligned with our thinking. So at that time, we were told this was going to be a 1 to 3 year initiative. So thinking worst case scenario, we're done in 2014 and off to the races we go with our new suite of regulations. Fast forward 14 years from then, or 13 years from the 2011 announcement. Over 20 consultations, public consultations later, we are finally at a stage where those regulations that we were hoping for back in the early 2010s have been published. And that happened on July 3rd of this year.
So I'm sure that we could do an entire discussion of why it took that long.
Yes.
Or we can just refer to a government's 3 to 4 years is actually 14. But
that's about right. Yeah.
That's about right. Okay. So we're here now, though. So let's dig in then a little. So we do have this new set. They've been gazetted, which means this becomes the new regulations that this industry abides by. Thinking back to sort of what was proposed and perhaps now what has been set as regulation, what were some of the major things that the Feed Association wanted to see changed in the regulations?
Yeah. So our base for these regulations was really to focus on feed safety. We all know feed safety, safe feed makes safe food. It's good for animal health. It's good for the products that the animals are producing. So our main focus to government, or our main ask was, can we focus on feed safety? The previous regulations focused a lot on nutrition, very basic nutrition, which in 1983 was potentially needed. Nowadays, we all have nutritionists that work for feed mills that are very well educated and experts in their field, and they're the ones that follow the science and are most up to date. The previous regulations used to dictate the nutrients that we had to put in feed, so a minimum amount of nutrients and a maximum amount of nutrients. And the minimums were really a problem because in some cases we actually had to add extra nutrients in feed that didn't need to be there. We knew with knowledge and education it didn't need to be there. Either it was being provided with some on-farm forages or on-farm grains, or just those animals did no longer require that amount. We really wanted to modernize, really bring focus on feed safety, focus on innovation, bringing new products to the market, and get away from the nitty-gritty nutrition work that is evolving on an annual basis. We're always learning more about nutrients and about how to feed livestock. And, when it takes 41 years for regulations to be updated, that's just too slow. It doesn't follow the science. So those were really some of our focus. And glad to say that we have, we still have maximum nutrient levels in place with the new regulations, which the purpose there is to ensure that we're not going to have an animal health issue, a food residue issue of too much of a certain nutrient, or an environmental issue. And that's really focusing, again, on safety, right? Making sure that, we're not putting too much in where there could be safety concerns. And that's great. That's right in line with what we wanted all the way back, from 2010, what we asked for.
So obviously you represent the feed industry, so feed ingredient manufacturers, that side of who's actually putting together supplements and different feed, et cetera. From a farm level, farmers will check tags and those sorts of things. But you're right, many are using, either the services of perhaps their feed supplier to work with a nutritionist to balance a diet or make a TMR, those sorts of things. But those tags, I'm going to assume, will still exist. But
absolutely,
the minimums, so you're saying, though, the minimum for some things where there were rules as to a minimum amount of certain things, will that go away, or will that simply just not be required anymore to be included in those feeds?
So it's not going away. Like you said, every label, every feed is still going to have a tag. It's going to tell the producer exactly what they need to know about that feed. So it's not changing at all. It's just changing. For example, if it said that we needed so much, phosphorus is a great example. And I don't know how many calls I've gotten over the past 14 years about phosphorus and why is there so much phosphorus in feed when we're already having, some issues in our waterways, especially in the Winnipeg, Manitoba area. There was a lot of, frustration there. And so, the regulations told us we had to have a minimum of X amount of phosphorus in a complete feed, in a complete diet, what the animal is going to eat at the end of the day, whereas that's no longer there. And as an industry, we're obviously going to put what the animal needs as a minimum. We're not going to go underneath a minimum. If not, the animal would get sick. We would lose business. It's just not in anybody's best interest. So the nutrient requirements of the animals are always going to be met by the industry. We know what the animal needs. It's some of those areas where we actually have to put more than what the animal needed because the regulations dictated us to do that we will no longer need to be doing. But rest assured that all labels, all information that a producer is used to seeing, whether it's an ingredient that they're buying or whether it's a bag of feed that is ready to feed as a complete diet to their livestock or a supplement going into their TMR, that will still come with the label. You will understand what nutrients, what vitamins, what minerals are in there. The information is still there. And that's all part, again, of what we've asked from day one, feed safety. You need to know that information to make sure that your feed is going to be safe for your livestock. What the regulations will hopefully do is help us bring new products to market, still being regulated and still being reviewed for safety, but bring us more aligned with our EU and our US counterparts as far as being able to bring new ingredients to market. Some of those innovative feed ingredients is what we hope. So that the regulatory system will be more favorable to companies kind of wanting to come to Canada. Right now, it's extremely long to get an ingredient approved. And so the burden of what they need to provide is all in policy, but the regulations hopefully will at least make things happen quicker. So we're not waiting 3 years for a new innovation to come to the Canadian marketplace.
Mm-hmm. And has that been a push from your membership to say, there are ingredients we sell, because I'm going to assume that you have, members that do business in other jurisdictions.
Yeah.
Has there been a lot of frustration as to what they can and cannot bring to Canada?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is probably one of the biggest complaints I get from my members is that they've got products in the EU or in the US that they're allowed to sell and use. And they've either tried to come to Canada and have been rejected, or the wait is too long. The reality, and we've got the same problem in the pharmaceutical world here in Canada, is our markets are much smaller than the EU and the US. So companies are obviously going to be more enticed to get a product approved in those jurisdictions where they'll have bigger sales. So we're hoping to be able to have that regulatory environment that makes the burden not so high. Burden's still there to prove science and prove safety, but not so high that it pushes them away from coming to the Canadian marketplace.
So thinking again to sort of from a producer's perspective, do you foresee any major changes that they would notice?
I don't think they're going to notice much as on a day-to-day basis. So part of this new suite of regulations requires us, anyone that manufactures feed and sells feed. So as soon as you manufacture feed not for your own livestock, you're considered commercial feed mill, and you need to meet all of the regulations. For us, a lot of the stuff is the same. Some feed mills had no preventive controls in place for feed safety. That is now mandated in the new regs. Through our program, we have a voluntary program that has preventive controls called Feed Assure here in Canada, and it's still above what is required by the regulations. About 70% of the commercial feed manufactured in Canada is already manufactured under that program. So those facilities, it's going to be a seamless implementation. They've had this in place for 10, 15, 20 years. It's just bringing the other people a little bit closer to that high level of standard of feed safety. As far as producers, any producer that's mixing medication on farm, mixing their own feed with medication on farm, will also need to have some kind of preventive control plan in place, which is a much more simplified preventive control plan. And that's just to ensure that you're not going to overdose your animals, you're not going to end up with food, drug residues in food. So that might be the only part that producers will really see if they are manufacturing their own feed and using medications in their feed. But for the rest, the hope is that it's just more of a, they have more access. We now are able to include veterinary health products in feeds, which we were not allowed to do with our previous regulations. So hopefully it's just being able to bring some of those great new innovations to the Canadian marketplace and give those producers that are facing a lot of pressures to reduce antimicrobial use, for example, some other tools to be able to ensure their livestock stay healthy and their production goals continue to be met. Well, we're going to say the next year and a half, we're going to be extremely busy supporting our members in implementing the new regulations. So for the commercial industry, there's a lot of changes that are coming, a lot of great changes. Some require them to change the way they do things. And so our association's focus is really going to be about supporting them so that they understand what the new regulations are. And the work's not always done as soon as the regulations stop. A lot of the regulations say you have to do this, this, and this, or we have to approve an ingredient, for example, but it doesn't say the how. And that all comes down to policy and guidance. And so a lot of our work is going to be working with CFIA to ensure that the policy and guidance are realistic, are fair, and are science-based.
Well, thank you to Melissa with ANAC for joining me for that fascinating conversation. And thank you, of course, to all my guests on today's show. And huge shout out to FP Genetics for sponsoring today's show. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, on Tuesdays, Tuesday with Lyndsey. Yes, that's me. Would love any of your feedback on today's show. 855-776-6147. Or, of course, you can find us across social media. I am L. Smith at RealAgriculture.com for email, or head on over to RealAgriculture.com and check out all of these interviews in their full entirety, and, of course, any past episodes of RealAg Radio. Have a wonderful week, everyone. Cheers, everybody.